I was going to do a different kind of video this week, but then going through some of my materials, I realized I've had these on hand for like over 10 years. It's just one of those things, you know, where you think, I'm gonna get around to that, and then the next year, I'm gonna get around to that, and then the next year. To get a better look at these, this is book board glued to paper. And this paper is from a calendar called Stendig calendar. I used to have one in, I think, 2009. And I recycled all of the calendar pages into book covers. And way before I started this channel, I used to be an Etsy shop. And a lot of my books that I sold in that shop were this kind of book. I ended up making so many that I decided to just pre-make covers so then I could just do the binding whenever I had time. They don't have binding holes, so maybe this would be a good opportunity to experiment and try some different bindings. I don't know, I'm just keeping it open. That's part of the fun. So let's just like chill out today and revisit 10-plus-year-old projects and make some books. For these covers, I'm thinking of doing something similar to my Mystic Chain Stitch book, since the covers are the same size and I think the black book guard on the spine would look good with the type. So I'm pretty much following the same measurements that I used in that video and using black cardstock for the inside covers. And I'm sure you're thinking, Jennifer, why are you doing the same tutorial you've already shown us? Well, I'm thinking of doing a different binding on this one. And I actually like using that book guard tape a lot. In fact, I want to try it in some different colors in future books. Again, I'm going through the same steps that I show in that video, so you can check it out if you want the full version of this. For the inside signatures, I'm using 8 sheets, and I'm going to cut all of these letter size sheets in half. Then divide those into groups of 8, and I'm going to fold all of those 8 sheets into one signature. And I repeated that to make 2 signatures. Now for the binding holes, you guessed it, I'm going to use my binding guide tool, but you can of course use an awl or a thumbtack. And I'm piercing holes that are a ½ inch apart. Now taking those back to the cover, I'm using one signature as a template and marking along the spine where the holes will go, using a white pen so I can see them easier, then piercing through that with an awl. And now I'm ready to experiment with a new bookbinding method. I'm thinking of trying this thread eye binding, which is in this Keith Smith book. If you're serious about bookbinding, I'll link this down below. He has published some really great books. Using a waxed line of thread for each signature, and each one gets its own needle. Twisting the threads together once on the outside. And if I wanted to do the thread eye method, I would return the needle back through the hole that it came out of. But I decided to experiment further and see what it looks like if I return the needle to the hole below it. I don't know what this binding is called, but it would create a sort of twisted X pattern, and that's what I went with. I also found it helpful to use binding clips to hold the signatures in place. This is a pretty easy binding method. You just twist the threads on the outside and return the needle back through the signatures. I found it easier to leave the thread unknotted or untied until the end. That way, when I'm done with the stitching, I can go back and adjust the X's to be more aligned if they need to be. Then on the inside, I tied each end of thread off in a knot onto the stitch right next to it, and trimmed off any excess. If I do find out what this binding method is called, I will add it in the description, but I'm glad I went with this one. I think it works well with this book. I know I already showed you this form of book before, but I do like how the book guard allows it to lay flat, and I just like this style right now. I especially like this binding with 2 different colors of thread. I think it creates a fun texture on the spine of the book, and you could totally try some different variations. On to the next book. I'm first going to finish wrapping these covers. Not sure what to use for the binding quite yet. Trimming the flaps of paper and gluing them down. At this point, I think I want to try a hardcover French link stitch book. I just uploaded this tutorial, I'll link it down below, and there's a method I want to try out with it that I've never tried before. To make the end pages, I folded a letter-sized piece of cardstock in half, then cut it in half, and that will give me 2 end pages in the same size as the covers. I like to use a highlighter to figure out the spacing of the binding holes and then wipe it off later, so I used that to punch the binding holes in the end pages, and then glued one side to the cover. And I did this process for the front and back cover. For the inside pages, I thought it would be fun to use all black paper. I cut 10 of these sheets in half, and this stuff is pretty thick, so I'm only going to use 2 folded sheets per signature. And I made enough of these to give me 10 signatures total. Then I put those in the binding guide to pierce the binding holes. By the way, if you're curious about this tool, I do have a video all about it linked below. Now for the binding, I'm excited to use this multicolor thread against this black paper. And like I said, I'm going to use a French link stitch method, which I already have a tutorial for. You can go check it out up here and down below. This is a video dedicated to just the binding method, so you can easily learn how to do it step by step. The only difference in this book I'm making here is I combined it with an extra row of Coptic stitching. To make this work, I made a little loop that I left on the first signature or end page to bind with. And that way, the next signature I add on will have something to stitch through. And the rest of the binding is basically the same as that tutorial, a French link stitch combined with kettle stitching, and then that center area is just Coptic stitching, which is just looping behind the previous stitch. I think it sounds more complicated than it actually is, so if you tried to make this, you'll get the hang of it. It's more simple than it sounds. I did run into a little bit of a problem while binding this, and I left it in here, so maybe it'll help you guys. As I was stitching, the thread ripped through the paper. My solution to repair this was to rip up a tiny piece of paper in the same color, put it on my extra strength glue stick, and add it just to that section that ripped through. And this is on the inside of the fold, and I think having a ripped piece of paper will help it blend into the paper. I also added a little bit of that same glue to the outside of the fold, and let that all dry before moving on to the binding. I think this repair method worked pretty well. You can barely see the patch of paper on the rip. I also made another one to cover a small rip that also happened right here. I guess I was pulling too hard for the weight of this cardstock, so experience, this happens, and if this happens to you, you can try this repair. Despite the repairs, this was a fun book to try, and I had fun experimenting with the additional Coptic stitch in the binding. So far, French link stitch is one of my favorites right now, so I just want to keep doing it. I love how it lets your book lay completely flat. And I do think this method of a hardcover works. Just make sure that the end page is a thick enough paper to hold the weight of the board, and it's heavy enough to take the tension of the binding thread. It feels good to finally finish these covers that have been sitting in my stash for 10 years. If you make your own version, I would love to see your pictures, so share with me on my social links and add a hashtag #heysealemon. Give this video a thumbs up and leave any video requests in the comments. Also, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, and to sign up for post notifications, hit that bell so you don't miss any of my videos. Shout out to my patrons and YouTube members. Thanks for supporting my channel. You can find out more information on supporting in the links below, and you can also check out more binding methods and book tutorials in this playlist. I'll link everything down below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!